I'm getting. I have to leave for 1 minute.
All right. Uh, Dominic has a plumber coming to work on his house, so we'll be right back. But in the meantime, I'm going to get us started off. Welcome to Friday. Welcome to the Kudomusicology, a Ludomusicology Literature review stream. I am your host, Musicologess. And this month, sort of before we launch into the Summer of Summers, which is coming soon, we're spending a few weeks here looking at some chapters in the newly released as of April. Where did I put my copy of the book? Oh, here it is. Intersection of animation, video games, and music, Making Movements Sing, which is edited by Lisa Scoggin and me. So this is a really exciting project and one that's always going to be very near and dear to my heart because it was my first foray into editing anything within the field. So I have been doing some editing for a few years now for a company that works with people finishing dissertations and thesis projects. But most of the editing I would do for that was outside of my field, so I would have like a lot of nursing degrees and stuff. So I had done a lot of nursing. I had done a lot of editing, copy editing, proofreading, as well as some stuff on content, but it's very different when you get to edit something in your field, because you sort of feel like you have a lot more to contribute to the content. So, but I did feel like all of the years doing the more technical side of the editing made me a useful contribution. Hopefully, I know Lisa was saying, I'm glad that you have an eye for little misplaced punctuation and like that stuff, because a lot of people don't enjoy that. Reformatting citations and that sort of thing. I enjoy that. I find it kind of soothing. So Lisa and I really enjoyed working together on this. We did record a conversation that I just need to find a good day to stream, sort of on the process of putting together this book. So we will do that soon. But in the meantime, we are doing a few chapters from this. So today we have Dominic Arsenault. Welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much.
So I'm trying to remember. It's not that like this book was that long of a process relative to some things in academic publishing, but I don't really. I feel like I was brought in and then we put out a call for papers, and I don't really remember soliciting anybody in particular because I just wasn't sure with the animation piece who was going to have what, even within Ludomusicology. I remember promoting the call for papers, but I'm pretty sure, you and everybody else just sort of submitted proposals, and then I saw, people I knew. So,
That's what happened. It was a cold call, no, the cold proposal, I
mm-hmm,
guess.
mm-hmm.
So I saw the call, and I was teaching, and I'm still teaching a class on animation film in my department. So when I saw that and your name on there, I was like, okay, this is a place where I could write this piece on DuckTales Remastered, which is a game that I was finding fascinating, and I was sort of waiting for an occasion to talk about it and explore it.
Yeah. Well, I love that moment when you sort of find the right home for a project, whether it's like, oh, okay, I gave this conference paper back several years ago. I haven't really done anything, and then you sort of see the right volume or the right special issue of a journal, and or somebody asks you because they're putting something together, and it seems really serendipitous when that happens. You're like, oh, finally. Um,
Yeah, and things click together. You're like, oh, I had this vague idea, and now there's this, and it fits. Wow, okay, let's do something.
Yeah, so this was an absolutely perfect fit for the volume because, of course, we know the beloved DuckTales cartoon. So, and then the video game itself, and then the remasters got a lot of attention. Both the cartoon relaunch and then um, the video game and then the cartoon relaunch. So it sort of brought those into the modern day so that folks could interact with them now. And I know especially the video game was such an interesting approach to the original, and we'll get into all of the weeds with that. But first, I wanted to congratulate you on a full professor. Yay! Everyone
Thank
clap
you.
in the chat. It's exciting. So congrats on that. I know that's been a
Thank
long
you.
process. I remember, over a couple of years now, seeing you put together your tenure dossier, and I remember at one point Will Gibbons mentioned writing a letter for you. Like, we were just chatting, and it mentioned he was writing a letter for you and stuff. So I know that's a real process.
So you got some inside information.
Not really. He just mentioned he was doing it.
But yeah, he was one of the people who wrote a recommendation letter, and I was really grateful to have his I guess I'm going to say his weight, but it's not. So it was really useful, especially since I'm not in musicology, or I'm not in a music department. So having someone from Ludomusicology look at like the kind of things that I did was interesting and validating in a way. Because you always have imposter syndrome, I think, when you're in academia in general, and then when you write something that's a little outside your expertise, you're like, I hope it makes sense and it's valuable.
Right. Well, tell us, before we launch into the chapter itself, tell us a little bit about sort of your background in gaming, music, academia, and then what brought you into Ludo specifically.
So I did my master's and my PhD in studying video games, but not in video game studies because it didn't exist yet. I did my master's in 2004 from 2006. So I was in film studies, but I had the chance to happen upon Bernard Perron, who had already published this anthology, The Video Game Theory Reader 1. So he was like, no, you should write on games, no problem. So that was sort of the odd thing to do, like to do a film degree, but not talk about film. So I did that for a master's and PhD. But my main focus was on narration and storytelling because I used to work as a writer for a video game company in Montreal. It was a small thing, nothing major. But I thought I should go to work on narration and storytelling for games. So that's why I went to do a master's and a PhD. But then I wrote one paper on Guitar Hero in 2005 or 6, maybe, probably 2007 actually, because I think it wasn't even out in 2006. Anyway, so when the game came out and I played and I liked it, I wrote a paper on it, which was a one-off thing. And then the paper sort of got, distribution and traction, and people started referencing it. And so I was happy with that, but that was it. And I used to be a musician in a metal band, so I wanted to keep doing metal music, but solo. And one way to actually get to do that was to use computerized sounds, digital sounds. And so I tried using the NES sounds and Atari 2600 sounds and things like that to do some metal music. So crafting music was my way to keep active in music. And then at one point, I started going to the North American conference, the NACVGM, right? Dude. So that was awesome. And I sort of started doing more and more work in that direction.
Oh, that's awesome. So do you have an undergraduate degree in music, or? Oh,
No,
wow.
I actually have grade 7 training in music.
Okay, wow.
Oh, just a second. I need to go back.
So cool to think of Dominic being on the sort of cutting edge of the field, because I mean, Colin's game sound stuff is coming out like right around the same time that he's getting interested in all of this. So in many ways, Dominic predates me in the field, which is pretty cool. Because I didn't really get involved until my PhD, so which I started in 2013. No, when did I start my PhD? 2011. Because I went right from my master's. 2011. I lose track of time. I think we all do. But yeah, I love this. I love this chapter. I'm really happy to feature it. And I Love a metal band in general. Always have. I was a big metal listener in high school. So we will today be focusing on the retrospective and retrocursive stances. We'll find out what those are in retro game aesthetics. How DuckTales Remastered got the last Quack. That title, there were a lot of like workshopping of the title along the way. Like there were really much longer versions of this title. I'm really happy with the last Quack and where we ended up with this. So this is our newly published Routledge title from 2023, and it's chapter 10 in the volume. And the kind of fun thing about this, as I've maybe mentioned last week, is the idea that we had folks coming that either were more rooted in the video game side of things or more rooted in animation studies and film or actual animating. In the case of Maria Lorenzo Hernandez on the Greed chapter. So we did have some folks coming from all over the place, and some names that we knew that either Lisa or me or both of us knew pretty well, and then also people that were new to us that we neither of us had really worked with. So that was pretty exciting to make those connections and be able to interface with all of these authors. And really one of the biggest things as we were sort of helping people develop the chapters was to make sure that we were sort of triangulating all three things from the title. So making sure that, okay, if you're focusing on a video game, it has to have what's the tie to the animation side of things. Most folks had the music involved as a part of what they were doing, but it was always like, okay, are you looking at an animated series? Like, how does this connect to the video game, or how does the video game connect to the animation? And just make sure that every chapter has a mix of all three. And I think pretty compellingly in most cases, because this was sort of the whole genesis of the volume was Lisa realizing just how much, in Japan we have the media mix, which gets talked about in several of the anime chapters in the book, and certainly over here we just have constant adaptation one way or the other, or sometimes continuously if it's a really popular series, where we get animated series made out of a video game, and then a video game adapted from an animated series, and then further down the line we start getting what Dominic's writing about here, where we get the video game remake of the original video game, or the reboot of the cartoon for a new generation. So it's nice to see these sort of classic things coming back. Hello, welcome.
Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries. Just fill in some time. All right. So we have the retrospective and retrocursive stances and retro game aesthetics, how DuckTales Remastered got the last Quack. And it opens with a personal anecdote on watching the reboot of the DuckTales cartoon, and just sort of saying not only that you had history with the NES game and with the original 80s cartoon, but that you had sort of watched these with your son and played the game, and so you got to kind of re-experience these more recently as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it was really, I don't know if you have like this whole thing planned out already, so I don't want to like spoil your future things.
No spoilers.
Okay. So yeah, and watching the show, we were like sitting there and sort of hearing the Moon theme music in the show, and it was like, oh, they put the Moon theme music in there, how cool! And seeing that finally the game exists in the cartoon, which was not something that could have happened. Well, I guess it could have happened back in the day for like the third season, maybe, I don't know, but so seeing that, and I would officially part of the timeline, so to speak.
Right, it kind of looped back on itself. And this is a moment where I remember Ryan Thompson posting when this episode aired, basically being like, "This makes it's made everybody cry, right?" Like to see this reworking. So we have the character of Della Duck, and she is trying to calm the crying baby of a moon monster, and she ends up saying, "Oh, I sang this lullaby to my ducklings before they hatched." And when we listen, we discover it's a texted version of the moon theme from the NES game. And then you wrote, Della's lullaby was new in some regard, yet utterly familiar, like it had always been there, reassuring like the stars in the vast emptiness of space, which we see on the show as she sings. So I'm going to court the copyright strike. We're going to watch it.
Oh my goodness.
At most, we'll just get the audio muted for that section. But, it's rare, but I felt like it was important to this chapter. So here it is. Here's the moment. If it will play. Play. Come on, Della. Sing to us. There we go. And she's crying, and everybody's crying, right?
I'm not crying.
I'm
You're
not crying. You're crying. I have actually retexted the retexting to sing it to my daughter. So, partially because of this chapter, because she was.
So you mentioned that in an email exchange, which is the best part of writing a chapter for a book, is when the editors like engage with you, and that was awesome. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that, and since then I've been twisting my mind thinking, yeah, but what's the rephrasing that works?
So her name's Josephine, so instead of baby boys, I say baby Joe, and then I say life is strange and vast as you will soon know. So I made it rhyme.
Wow.
So, but yeah, I sing it to her. And because I was inspired to because of this moment. Like it had come up again when Ryan mentioned it, but then it sort of like came up at the right time, where I'm always looking for things to slip into the rotation of the lullabies. So.
Oh, the lullabies. My lullaby when my son was really baby age, I guess, was Eight Eyes title team, which is an NES game. 8 Eyes. It's not very common, I think.
I like that.
But
yeah.
And I know that song because I had downloaded the big NSF archive. So it was like every Nintendo game alphabetically. Mm-hmm. So when you opened the NSF player, then it started with the first one in alphabetical order, which was 8 Eyes. And the first track would play as soon as I opened it. So it was like super familiar.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. So you said you played in a metal band. What do you play multiple instruments? Is it mostly guitar, bass, like?
So I was playing bass in a band called Dreamcatcher, and we worked under the name Dreamcatcher for like a year and a half, and then we changed to Soul Caged. And we were active for, I think, 2 or 3 years under Soul Caged. Then I left the band because I had my son, and I was doing my PhD, and so something had to give. And then I think they continued for a while, and they didn't like... I think they kept playing for like 2 years or something like that, and then this group sort of fell apart, from what I understand. And then aside from that, I was learning guitar just by myself for fun. And so when I started doing music by myself, then I would play actually the guitar, but not play the bass tracks. I would leave that to the NES sound chip.
Yeah. And you have an album of chip metal.
Yeah, actually I have 2 now.
You have 2 now.
I released my second album, The Serpentarius Arcana, in December 2022. So that was my second album, and the first one is called I have the old name in my head, but because it changed, it's called Power Up the Chips,
Oh, yeah.
and it was released in 2020.
Nice. We should drop a link to those in the chat for folks that want to look them up.
I will
I was
put
gonna say, is
that.
there like a SoundCloud or whatever?
There's a link
Linktree,
tree.
brilliant. Love it.
That works so well. I actually made my academic portfolio in Linktree as well. So it's kind of simple, but you put links towards your best work, papers, things like that, and
Yeah.
I have them both lined
Oh, I
up there.
love that. Yeah, I've seen folks on Instagram use Linktree like in their bio, because then you can only fit so much in the bio, so it kind of gets people to other places. Perfect. So we had these intense moments with the Della Duck version of a tune that was already really well loved, really popular, really standout track from this game. There's a zillion covers of it. If you look for Moon Theme covers, they're everywhere.
There's even this thing I've seen. I think it's Kathleen Kuo that was sharing it, or someone else in a Ludomusicology conference was sharing the picture in the MagFest festival. There's like a sign posted for bands that start the Moon Team in 4/4 and bands that actually know their shit. Shit.
They still, the year that I went, they still had that like on the signage, and they have little like Easter eggs throughout. So they have the actual helpful part of the signage, and then there's little like comments and stuff. Yeah, they still do that. Yeah, because Kathleen was working on video game cover bands. That was a really great NAC VGM paper. Classic. So anyway, this moment of seeing Della Duck, I mean, full circle in so many different ways, not the least because it sort of brought the video game into the cartoon instead of the other way around. And all of this gets interesting, and so, we start thinking about, there are a lot of different versions of DuckTales, but particularly the 2013 video game DuckTales Remastered, and all the forms of nostalgia involved here. Sometimes they're competing with each other, sometimes they're partnering in this retro phenomenon. How do they negotiate our relationship with the past? So the walkthrough here, as I call it, sort of tells us where the chapter's going. First, use theories of intertextuality to describe the 2013 game and how it differs from the 1989 original. Then, with a multidisciplinary set of tools drawn from video game design, video game history, and Ludomusicology, I will leverage the game's particularities to build a new approach to nostalgia and authenticity in retro game aesthetics, theorizing two stances or logics, the retrospective and the retrocursive, to better understand their workings and ultimately our relationship with history. Generally, if I read anything that's going to say, like, here's a new approach, I am suspicious off the bat. But as your editor, no, I thought you create a really, really neat way of, there's a lot written on nostalgia, but it works a little bit differently in video games than it seems to in literature and some other media. There's definitely some particularities to the retro game phenomenon, and I think that this is very useful to folks. I'm always pointing out how to assign these things in classes. It's like, this is way useful beyond the DuckTales itself. There are great chapters that are ultimately just very good close readings, case studies of the game at hand, and then there's stuff like this where there is a framework here that is really applicable, especially in this modern era where we have so many remakes, so many remixes, so many complete remasters. And this is something.
Yeah, so many.
Yeah, Ryan Thompson's been really interested in this lately. Just like all the all the remixes, the remakes, the remasters, the everything, redo, redux, and sort of
Redux.
like building out
DuckTales.
the Redux. Here, wait, they missed it. They missed an opportunity.
Yeah, they missed
the pun. Oh man, DuckTales Redux would have been so good.
There's still time for the third remake of or remaster or rething, I guess.
It's about time.
So maybe in 2034 they will do DuckTales
Yeah,
Redux.
that would be amazing. That would make me really happy. So I know Ryan is probably in love with this chapter. I will have him on soon because his chapter goes nicely with yours as well because he's looking at Kingdom Hearts and sort of it's a nice like flip side of the coin in terms of how you're referring to history as you add on to a franchise. But he also thinks about all of these notions of like remake, all the re's. So we also get into this idea of palimpsest, which is a really elegant way of thinking about it coming out of medieval studies. But first, we start off with some theory. Is it Jeanette?
Yeah, Jeanette. Yeah.
And transtextuality, which includes the kind of more familiar to most Ludo folk word, intertextuality, which is the direct citation or mention of another text, but also hypertextuality, by which an original anterior text, the hypotext, is present as inspiration or source material for a follow-up successor text, the hypertext. And I think a lot of times especially folks in game studies, mostly just use intertextuality kind of as the blanket term instead of transtextuality. And then they might be talking about something that's actually hypertextuality, but they refer to it as being intertextual. So it's a big web. So it's nice that you actually outline this. That's kind of a useful distinction for folks to make.
It's sort of a public service moment because even in literature and in film studies as well, people use intertextuality to talk about the links between texts. Also because Julia Kristeva used intertextuality differently from Jeanette. So there's sort of these two branches of intertextuality that can account for most of the usual things we do with that. So I think like Jeanette's whole theory of transtextual relationship hasn't really catched on a lot.
Yeah, and it's too bad because this is really useful. And it seems like a lot of times what we are actually talking about is hypertextuality, especially in gaming.
Yeah. And the other big word that catched from his work is paratext, which has become its own beast in itself.
As these terms often do. So this can include all kinds of different activities: parody, pastiche, caricature, forgery, but notably it excludes commentary. So it is, I mean, in a sense we are directly mentioning another text, but it's not. That's a different activity here.
Yeah, exactly. There's an otherness in the commentary that's you can't mistake the commentary for the original, or you can't not understand that the commentary is about the other text. Mm-hmm. Whereas you could see a pastiche but not really know what the original is about.
Makes sense. All right. So for those who are not medievalists, palimpsest, or maybe don't remember this from undergrad or music history. So a palimpsest is where we basically reuse parchment to make a new thing, and so we just erase or write over in some way. Technically, it's what happens if you use like whiteout liquid paper. The original's underneath it, and then you write on top of it by sort of painting on it. But in this case, the parchment, it's hard to erase it completely. And so there are folks that study and they can sort of see, here's the text that ended up on top, but then they can kind of read between the lines and see the traces of that original text and see what it was used for and then what it gets repurposed for. And often in medieval studies, it's like they can be completely unrelated. But often in media studies, we have this interesting phenomenon where we have something getting remade that is sort of referring to the original, or these little glimpses kind of peek through. Jordan Stokes has kind of used this framing as well in looking at the Link's Awakening remake and sort of the palimpsests that come in as some of the 8-bit chiptune sound is entering into that remastered soundscape. So it's a nice way to think of when we have these traces or references to the predecessor. And in the case of gaming, we're meant to have them in mind. This isn't just sort of a convenient reuse. I don't see Karen in the chat, so she can yell at me later if I'm getting palimpsest wrong, but so DuckTales Remastered positions itself as the hypertext to Capcom's DuckTales. And of course, then we can go further back. The 1989 video game is itself a hypertext to the 1987 television series, which in turn transposes characters and events portrayed in various Disney comic book strips and animated film shorts starting in the 1930s. So this could easily be a much longer chapter. So this chapter is going to just look at the four here: the 1989 game and its 2013 remaster, and then the 1987 series and its 2017 reboot. So in the game, we play as Scrooge McDuck. It is a 2D platformer. Hopefully most of our audience is at least somewhat familiar with one version of this. He pogos on his cane, can use that to jump around, but also as an attack, because he can pogo off the enemies, kind of like Mario, just stomping on a Goomba, but he uses his cane for it. And sort of has a flimsy plot, where you are traversing these levels, you're trying to get his treasures back, but it's not really given to us in the manual or in the game, the motivations behind stealing the treasure.
Is he trying to get his treasures back, or he's chasing new treasures?
Oh, that is the question, isn't it? So
it may not be clear.
Yeah, it's unclear. We just know that we are moving through the levels as Scrooge, collecting treasure. That's true. And we get to explore some different terrains as we do that. But the whole plot would fit into the general plot structure of one of the cartoon episodes, in that there's kind of like this escapade and gathering of treasure and fighting of evildoers and whatnot. So we see the game here as a remix of elements from the cartoon. Instead, the game remixes elements from the series in somewhat disconnected fashion. For example, the final race against Glomgold to reach the treasure atop the pillar offers a ludic reenactment of the show's introductory montage that opened every episode, where Scrooge and Glomgold climb a pillar to reach a magic lamp. So,
So it's sort of a remix where you sort of take the things from the show and you're like, okay, let's put that in the game somewhere.
Yeah, and then the person playing is like, oh, I've seen the show. Like, there's that moment.
Yeah.
So
exactly,
we can treat this as a palimpsest of the DuckTales show, and then the show itself being a palimpsest of prior comics of Donald Duck and Scrooge McDuck by Carl Barks. So there's a lot of scholarship on and just think pieces and writing and forum posts on notions of retro gaming and nostalgia. They're very large literatures to grapple with here. So it's important to define the terms. Retro ends up being, in a way, like intertextuality, in that it's getting used in such a broad fashion. And we can, if we use retro, we can use it to mean not only how old something is, but also what platform we're playing on, the interfaces that we're using, the visual complexity. So something could be done, a game like VVVVVV, where it is hearkening back to more like Atari style, not even NES style graphics. In terms of visual complexity, but it's a modern game. It's not old. And so we can use retro to sort of mean like hinting at the retro style as well. So it's a really, really broad term. And then there's some citations here to some different definitions of retro. But most interesting, I think, is Maria Garda drawing on Elizabeth Guffey, describing retro as the, quote, recreation, reconfiguration, rediscovery, it's always and recycling of outdated aesthetics from the recent past of living memory. And then this is further broken down into two forms, which if you read I don't know if my nostalgia book's near me. Sarah Pasternak Chenevey's nostalgia book. There's a lot of reference to these various forms of nostalgia as well. So restorative nostalgia is similar to when we are playing or collecting classic games, hardware, and then it also invokes all those attendant issues of preservation and authenticity and things like that. And then reflective nostalgia is more in line with the development of contemporary games in that retro style. So VVV, Fez, Undertale, a lot of really huge games. Stardew Valley, even is harkening back to Harvest Moon from the
Right.
Super Nintendo. So where we are referring back to an earlier era in some way.
We're talking about retro and the many definitions of retro. One of the recent definition, well, not a definition, it's like, and it's not an academic, but like people that collect retro games were talking about between themselves. They have a podcast and everything, and they were talking, and what is retro? I mean, is it something that's 10 years old or
Right.
more? Why 10? Why not 9? Is it like former generation games are retro? No, not really. Not when the new generation comes out, talking about consoles. But one of them said, something is retro when you need some type of adapter to plug it into your TV.
Absolutely true.
And I was like, that's interesting because, the fact that there's no support for plugging RCA plugs, I guess, today
Mm-hmm.
is, an indication that this is not to be considered actual by the people making the TV. So I guess there's something to that.
We do a lot of that in our household. My husband is a collector, and I always joke, come visit the archive sometime, everybody, because we have a really neat station set up in the basement of 5 different CRT televisions. Of different sizes, and one of them is tilted on its side for shooters that are vertical.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
and we have a complex switcher box, and so you pick the system you want, and then you pick which TV you want to output to, and then you enter a little code on the box, and it outputs and does the sound and everything. And then, so we can get really, really interesting experiences with at least the original hardware on a cathode ray television. So
That is impressive. You can play F-Zero and really see the speed
yeah,
at which the cars move.
yeah, and he's opened up the televisions and sworn to me that he won't electrocute himself, and tinkered to make sure that the visual geometry is correct, and he's
Wow.
very into this. So I'm familiar with this idea of the adapters, the upscalers, the switcher boxes, like all of the peripheral tech that makes this stuff playable. It's all about recapturing not the original experience, but an interesting recreation of that original experience. And I like the idea that like previous generation isn't sufficient for retro, right? And it reminds me a little bit about in like fashion or home decor when we talk about vintage versus antique.
Right.
At what point is it vintage? It's usually 30 years is what I've seen as a distinction for something to not just get sold in like a secondhand store. So that, to be in a true vintage shop, it has to be at least 30 years old. And then I think it's 50 or more, it starts to lean into antique. So,
How interesting.
yeah, I know this as somebody who's always loved retro, vintage, everything, not just in gaming. So, actually, behind me, you can see my
Yeah.
little piano. That's antique.
Wait.
The toy
Oh,
piano.
wow.
Mm-hmm.
How interesting.
Yeah, I literally got it for a song because the antique store was closing, and I was really excited about it because it looked so much like a real, it wasn't like a plasticky toy piano. I liked that it was like built like an upright and looked like a nice little piece of furniture, and so I played for them. They also had sheet music that I just pulled, and I was playing stuff for them, and so I got it. I got it for a
Wow.
song.
That is such a nice story.
Yeah, it was really fun. I really enjoy it. We actually have a different toy piano for the actual 2-year-old. So like this one stays, pretty careful. I've used it for like multi-tracking and stuff where I've like recorded in the sound of it. So
That is so nice. I have the old Casio PT1, small keyboard, battery powered. And once I gave a conference in CGSA, Canadian Game Studies Association, and I was talking about retro chip music, and I sort of realized that the Zelda 2 timbre that you get from the lead instruments is like emulating or simulating or approximating the Casio fantasy sound from that hardware. It's like when you play the notes, you actually see and
yeah.
have the same sort of wiggly.
Yeah, the vibrato. I when I think Zelda 2, I think of that very distinctive vibrato. Um,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
I also think that Zelda 2 is super underrated musically. I love Zelda 2 so much.
There's so much in
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice when, some of these more recent like Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild when they have those moments where they like finally quote Zelda 2 cuz that one almost never gets referenced, and as we refer back in the franchise it's always like Ocarina of Time and like stuff like that.
A Link to the Past and Zelda
Yeah,
1.
so when I do see these moments where like, oh, Zelda 2 popped up in something, I get so excited.
And not just to say how strange it is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that game. I think the music kept me playing that game in spite of how incredibly challenging. We mentioned that last night that there's a mode in Hollow Knight with permadeath where like you lose all your progress and have to go back to the beginning. And I was saying that's basically Zelda 2, right? I remember getting all the way to Death Mountain only to die and lose everything, and then you take a few months off because you're like, I don't know if I have it in me to try to play all that again. It's a real process. That game is hard. Anyway,
It is. It is.
what I really love here, you note that retro has this inherent openness to it because it is a prefix. So it is always appended onto something else, like retrospective. And then you had some examples in French, which I will not attempt to
Yeah.
pronounce because I read French. I do not speak well.
Oh, I understand. We have examples like, well, I don't know if you noted them
You
in
had rear
the,
view
I don't see them
mirror
here. So,
and
yeah, rear view mirror, rétroviseur. So le viseur is the scope,
mhm,
basically, but we also use that for the
mhm,
mirrors. So rétroviseur, when an officer does a mistake, he gets rétrogradé. So instead of increasing in rank, increasing in grade, he gets downgraded.
mhm,
So rétrogradé, rétropédaler also, which is, to pedal like in a bike, but then going backwards is to rétropédaler.
mhm.
So we sort of use rétro in various contexts appended to different words. So to me, rétro in itself is like, okay, rétro what?
Incomplete, sure. And in English, we use it just as a standalone noun. So this
Right.
openness is actually both why the term is so broad and vague. It's like it sort of finds all of these objects to attach itself to, but it's also why it's useful in thinking about different stances toward the past. Because now we get to your theory here. This retrospective, which is about looking backward toward the historical past from the contemporary present, which can involve nostalgia, it can be sentimental, it can be full of longing. And then Garda also has this reflective nostalgia that we mentioned between that which we've experienced ourselves. So think of the Proustian Madeleine, right? Taking you back. That scent, that taste, versus one that evokes more collective memories. And this, I have to always put a plug when people use this because it's Karen Cook's favorite word. It's anemoia. It's a nostalgia for a place and time one has never known.
That is awesome.
Yeah. She's used it a lot, so I associate it with her, and like because when people are talking about nostalgia, they often will refer to this phenomenon about like how can I be nostalgic for something I didn't experience, and Karen's like because it's anemoia. But you
So I have this new word I would
yeah,
use for my son, who is a big fan of retro games,
right.
big quotation marks, but yeah.
Yeah, and well, and it just again being a fan of like antique and vintage, and I was a competitive swing dancer in college for a little bit, and so I was listening to music from the 1940s. I was not born yet, I connected with my
Your
grandmother.
parents were maybe born.
Yeah, exactly. My parents weren't even born. But I was able to like show my grandmother, oh, I'm listening to the same thing she was listening to as a teenager. So that was kind of a neat moment that I was really nostalgic for it. I loved that sound, and particularly that sort of big band radio swing sound. Even string writing doesn't sound like that anymore. There's just a whole like performance practice around it. Clarinet writing certainly is kind of unique to that sort of Benny Goodman style. So I've always been nostalgic for it. So I don't know what the anamoic for it. Anamoic for it. I'll have to ask her what the adjectival form is.
Animaniac? No, that's not.
Animaniacs. That's Lisa's other work. So then we have the retrospective. We also, and that's a familiar term, like we look back, right? We also have retrocursive. So getting Latin up in here. The Latin retro meaning backwards, but also cursus, or the verb form currere, which is course or running. And this refers to stepping backward.
Exactly.
And by way of definition, you wrote, it involves displacing ourselves into the historical past by walking backward while still looking forward, maintaining a perspective of the contemporary present and future beyond. Designing a retro game often participates in both logics, to varying degrees and for different parts of the project. The stances are not meant to be used as classifying boxes to put retro things into one or the other, but to analytically decompose them and identify how and why either stance is used in their constitutive parts. So really useful that it's not an either or. I guess it could be.
Yeah. I guess
you
could.
You could. But really what's more interesting is that generally both are happening in different spots. So Guffey differentiates, this is where we start getting like retros used a little differently in gaming than it is in a lot of places. Guffey differentiates retro from camp and nostalgia by suggesting that it's ironic, non-serious, and subversive, and detached from the classics in a way. But we do not use it this way in gaming. Retro gaming really reifies certain franchises, certain games, certain consoles. I mean, how many retro gamers are like, oh, I love my Fairchild Channel F. Like we don't have a ton of people that are like highlighting only these things. It's a lot of Nintendo, maybe Sega. So there's a lot of consoles that have kind of gone by the wayside in retro gaming, and it's interesting that you use the term consecrated in terms of remakes. I love thinking about it the way that we're sort of making holy, holding up above other gaming.
It's also tied to canon and canonization,
right?
Which is just something religious from the start,
elevating to sainthood. Yeah, which are serving, so which games get consecrated? Which ones are serving as inspiration for folks who are making new retro style games? What are the ones that they're saying, oh, as we know, Eric Barone of Stardew Valley, he said it's a love letter to Harvest Moon. Like he's gone on record, and of course it's obvious to anyone playing, but, the ways in which there's definitely direct inspiration for some of it, but then there's these new things that are getting added.
A nice case of that was the ActRaiser Renaissance, which just came out like in 2020 or 2021, I guess. And like the game came out and like no one was expecting it. And people were like, wow, well, I really liked ActRaiser back in the days, but I never asked for this. Where is this coming from? So that was kind of strange because usually when you see remakes and remasters and re-editions and re-release, it's about games that have this certain aura and for which fans are clamoring, like Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah, and let's notice for a minute, because I'm a huge Final Fantasy VIII person. What happened to 8? We remastered the graphics, but we left everything else. It got a little touch up. That's it. Are we ever going to get what happened to 7 with 8? No, probably not. Because for some reason, everyone has been like convinced for years that it's not as good of a game and it's too much of a love story. I disagree, but that is a soapbox for another day.
But wrong. So
I think 8, especially musically, is so underrated. But we know this because we
Eyes
played
on me.
it. When we played it on the channel, Julianne and I are both big fans of 8. And I actually have the very controversial opinion that I think 8 is better than 7. So
That is some
don't at
controversy.
me,
It's not the
everybody.
same.
I think most of the folks that watch this know that of me. They know I'm very. I just, it was the game I really connected to. Obviously they came out within a couple of years of each other. I played them both. They were actually some of the first games I really remember playing as they came out, because my brother and I got the NES in, I guess it would have been 91, 92.
Right.
So we were always playing the NES and the Super NES games a little bit behind when they were actually coming out. But then, yeah, we switched over to PC gaming because we just couldn't afford to keep up with consoles anymore. So we kind of skipped out by the time we hit N64, and then we played the PC releases of 7 and 8. And I'll never forget that intro cutscene of 8. Felt like gaming can't get better than this.
Oh yeah, totally. I'm with you on that. Actually, we had the PlayStation Magazine demo discs or something like that, and or there was, I think, a preview of Final Fantasy VIII, a playable demo as an add-on disc to Brave Fencer Musashi, which was a second-rate game, let's call it that way. So my brother bought it, and we sort of spun the disc, seeing the intro to Final 8, like before it came out, like for months. And my brother was a huge Final Fantasy VIII fan, so I get the sentiment.
Yeah. But it's interesting that even within a franchise, we were talking about Zelda 2. Similarly, like Zelda 2 isn't going to be getting the kind of treatment that Link's Awakening did, right? Like where we get like this totally new, it almost looks like Playmobil, like plastic, like a toy play set that you're moving Link around. We're not going to get that with certain games, especially in these massive franchises where they have like 40 of them. They can't afford to do every single game like that. But
I'm thinking they're hoping that one day AI will do it for them.
Oh, that's sort of sad. A lot of that, well, the thing is, like, would AI have the creative impulse to do more than just sort of update, like, everything, make the graphics more real? Like, the idea to make Link's Awakening into that sort of, like, play set aesthetic.
Yeah.
That was a really interesting choice. It fits and feels really good, but I don't know if, I feel like AI would just be like, here's more photorealistic graphics.
Yeah, probably. And it's one of the questions I think that Final Fantasy VII Remake asks, which makes it an interesting game, is that, I loved it until the last 3 hours, and then it sort of crumbled apart when the revelations came in, and I was like, oh, it's not really okay. But, even if I didn't like the ending, I sort of respect the game for it, because it tries to answer a question, which is, how do you remake a game that has this iconic plot twist that everyone knows about, even if they haven't played it? So, like, of course, you can remake it as is, but, I mean, it doesn't have the same value when you play it knowing what happens 20 years later than what it actually did back then. So it sort of asks the question and tries to solve it or attempts to do something with it. Like, we can't do a remake of the game because the game happened and it's been with us in our culture since then. So how do we remake this? Then we sort of, have to try to do something else and address this in our remake. The fact that it's already known, and so the fate is predetermined, and so there's something that's going to derail the story and make everything possible. So I thought that was interesting, even if it was flimsily executed, in my opinion.
Here's what I want to happen, because obviously there are going to be future installments. That was just the opening section of FF7, which itself was like a 60-hour game. But what I want to happen is make it so that, like,
Cloud wakes up as Squall.
No, make it so that it seems like it's clear that, like, well, to me, it seems like Aerith is self-aware. Aerith is self-aware.
Yep.
Knows about the previous game, knows what happened. They're clearly opening up a space where, like, we might be able to change history, sort of, and, like, maybe she doesn't die when she dies. And what I want to happen is I want it to, like, for you to have that glimmer of hope, but for her to get killed anyway in a different way. So then it twists the knife of, like, haha, you thought You thought it was going to be different this time, but then it just changes the when. And that way folks could still have that like traumatic moment of loss, just like they report having for the original, but with that glimmer of hope of like, oh, it's going to be different this time. Like, how
And
good
then
would
Q
that
pull
be?
up. Well, I mean, I think it would be okay. It would be nice. I would say nice. Now it would be good. Yeah, it would be
I,
good. Yeah,
I
but
think that would
I
be
mean,
really effective.
if I get in this situation where I can hope that I can have Aerith not die, I know that she has died in the original
Mm-hmm.
version, so I know that they can be putting this setup for me to get my hopes
Mm-hmm.
up, like what you described,
Yeah.
right? Like I know that, so I am envisioning this possibility.
Right. But there
Whereas,
would still be
so
that like that thought of, well, maybe they just want her to be a playable character to the end. Maybe they want you to be like, you wouldn't really know when the shoe's going to drop. And that's why it would be really, I think,
that's true.
maybe not equally as effective, but it would be an effective way to do that if they were going to do it.
But then it becomes a question like a jump scare in a horror
Mm-hmm.
movie. Like you don't know when it's going to happen, but of course when it happens, you're not particularly shocked about because you were expecting
I
it,
don't know about
you know.
that. My husband reacts to jump scares just in general. So much so that it'll make me jump.
Double jump
Yeah, it's
scare.
more like I jump at the jump scare reaction. But
Yeah.
anyway,
But
certain games get this like this
yeah,
elevation above others, this canonization, and the way that, especially within Final Fantasy, the games have been remixed and recreated differently, I think is sort of proof of this entire logic. In terms of these stances, and when are we being more restorative, when are we being more retrocursive, when are we being more retrospective. That's what makes this really useful. If we start applying this to Final Fantasy games, we start seeing some really interesting ways of applying this, which we'll come back to here in a minute. So retro gaming communities talk a ton. Anyone who spends time on the forums knows about authenticity, fidelity to the original experience, which in our household and others includes playing on original hardware and CRTs. But also you can mimic these effects through software in your emulator. So you can have a filter in the emulator that adds scan lines. You can do things like that. Retro gaming also involves the creation of modern games, though, using that retrospective instead of a retrocursive stance. So when we create ports attempting to exactly translate, it's a translation at the end of the day, but trying to faithfully translate source code to a new platform, we do lose something of the experience because now you have a totally new controller, you have different screens, you have, a completely different feel of the game, but where they're at least
and you
saying
are
we haven't really touched the source code in the theory.
that's true. That's true. And you are playing in an environment where everyone can have their own
Yeah.
screen and unlimited screen time and things like that. So
It,
you can never go
it
back.
is a lot different to, being on the gateway PC in the 90s and mom can't use the phone for 3 hours because I need to be on AOL Instant Messenger. Like that negotiation within the family is different now. If there even is one. Like maybe the whole family has one Switch and so we're fighting over Tears. Actually, Sarah PC last night was saying that they ended up getting another Switch in the household because of this, because of Tears of the Kingdom, because everyone wanted to
That's the
play on
plan.
it. So a lot of these recreations love a Baudrillard reference. It classes up the joint on this stream to have some critical theory up in here. Simulacra and Simulation from 1981. He kind of finds recreations of the past a little disquieting. The simulation, they are disquieting simulations in their perfection, ultimately leading to hyper reality, a reality made of simulations, erasing their origins as simulations. So the idea that these things are getting kind of cleaned up, they run a little smoother. There are often, even in these sort of faithful ports, little like quality of life adjustments where loading screens don't need the time that they did back, so like you're not waiting as long, or there isn't a loading screen, or there's just little things that are very, very subtle. versus playing on the retro gamer like original hardware. But Guffey argues that retro objects aren't just simulations, but actually offer new content through their configuration, which I think is a useful thing to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's this interesting, like, personal anecdote when I was playing Tex Murphy Under a Killing Moon, I think, which is an adventure game where you sort of see people and interrogate them. And then you sort of have this city that's open, and you can click on the place where you want to go to visit a character. And then you can ask them like 25 questions or something, and there's like 9 places, so it ends up creating a lot of possibilities. But then if you click on this place to visit this character, then and you're on disk number 4, then it asks you to insert disk number 3. So you're like, okay, I'm not supposed to go there.
Yeah.
So you cancel, try something else. Okay, it also asks me to put another disk. So no, of course not. And then you find the person that doesn't ask you to switch disks, which means they have prepared the content on the disks to fit that. So, but of course, if you're playing this new version that sort of takes the 6 CDs and just makes a huge binary out of it, then when you play, you don't have these kinds of messages or load times or things like that.
Oh, I love that example. That's perfect. And in that sense, you're sort of missing things that would have been clues originally. But now we have... it isn't time travel no matter what. If we play an emulated game today or on original hardware, if we do this whole like I am playing on the CRT, we have online forums, we have walkthroughs, we have guides, we have whole YouTube channels with tips and tricks, we have Twitch streams, we have our own you mentioned our own screens where we don't have to negotiate time with a sibling or a parent to play. So with this retrospective stance, we look back in the past, but we do not travel there. The time machine metaphor and play, really, the time machine is impossible. we can only sort of recreate the experience for ourselves later on. So retro games are interesting too because they are at odds with an industry that's always innovating graphics and speed and new consoles and new. And it sort of keeps the retro in this timelessness, this ever-presence in modern gaming culture. And it ends up running parallel to the most technologically advanced games. So instead of being seen as sort of old-fashioned as a negative, it ends up being this viable way to experience gaming and just almost like a different genre. Like, okay, you can have this experience too, and it's completely valid, and it is it's just another option.
Oh, hey, Pete.
Summer course.
Thanks for joining us.
What's your summer course, Pete?
Teaching a summer course.
My summer courses are all asynchronous, so I get to sort of
I'm teaching a summer course on Wednesday.
On Wednesday, yeah, on game design. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, it's a research creation class for masters and PhDs who are not doing game development classes, so it's kind of interesting challenges.
What a useful experience to like really get into the weeds of having to create and use the technologies. Ooh, chromatic harmony. I need that class. I had terrible harmony. I insist to this day. I really needed more theory training than I got at conservatory. Because like we, as an example, did not do pretonal. We did not do posttonal in the theory classes. What exposure I had to them was in the music history classes where we looked at like a matrix and, all of the different transformations. We didn't do counterpoint. Those were separate classes. So for a lot of undergrad music majors, they end up taking classes in those things at least. So wonderful. Yeah, this chapter's, if you haven't read it yet, Pete, this chapter is great. So read it post haste. It's so good. So we're talking about all these retros and all the remakes, remixes, re's. So this retrospection, this looking back, going hand in hand with the notion of teleology, the notion of evolution or inevitable technological progression. As when we think about 2D games as not yet 3D, or we think about only having set number of channels in the audio, that sort of thing, which you have a nice remedy for, which again, I'm always on my soapbox about this because folks really like to talk about limitation. It's always about limitation of the old hardware. It's so often not about the affordances of you have to delimit to even have a creation, right? You can't just have formlessness. So you already make a limitation as soon as you decide what instruments you're going to use, what form you're going to use. So there is a bit of that. But so often we look at what they couldn't do and that's not how anybody was approaching it. I mean, I'm sure people bumped up against limitations, but they're often thinking, well, okay, what can I do to get the sound I want? They're writing for the system they have in front of them.
Yeah. It's sort of like trying to think about your voice and how you can sing in terms of limitations, Oh, I can't go that high. Oh, I can't produce 2 notes. Oh, I can't go there. Well, it's like, yeah, you can, but you can think about it that way, but usually you don't.
Right.
Sort of like, here's the frame. So here's all I can do within that frame.
So deploying the retrocursive stance means traveling back to the past and situating ourselves within that space-time, trying to reconstruct the historical present and its horizon of expectations, the state of the art as it was then. Once we reach a point sufficiently close to the object of investigation through the retrocursive stance, we will start seeing other things in the periphery, including the other directions the future might have taken, which is so useful. Really, really enjoy that sort of like thinking about. I remember saying, for anyone that thinks like, oh, the Atari 2600, so quaint, the channels aren't in tune with each other. There is often that thread of like, it's almost painful unless it's just melody and percussion, because they're out of tune with each other, and thinking like, yeah, but to someone in that era, like, this was really exciting. This was once the cutting edge. This was not being viewed with that sort of like paternalistic, that's not the right word, patronizing like attitude, like, oh, you poor thing, your channels aren't in tune. We were still creating within that space. So I appreciate that this avoids that kind of like teleological value judgment.
Yeah, that's right. And talking about the Atari, some people have perfect pitch and some people don't. And so I think I'm one of the people that have Atari pitch.
Atari pitch.
Because I grew up listening to an Atari, so I didn't know it was out of tune. Like it sounded like the Atari. I don't know.
Yeah, it gives it like a distinctive sound and aesthetic that is not going to be read by plenty of people as anything wrong, unless it's pointed out to them that it's not adhering to equal temperament, whatever. I always
the E.T. Title song. It's
classic.
That's what it is.
I'll never forget Neil Lerner giving that one paper. I don't remember what year of NACFGM it was, but he had his students, actually very fitting with this project, rescore E.T., but using the original limitations of how much space they had left on the cartridge, all the and they had to do it in the original style. And he had a student figure out a way to compress sound samples of Lil Jon and use that for the score, like the scoring. So it was Lil Jon going okay when you would like pass a level and and what when he would die. And he played the clip, and I wonder if he still has it and could like send it my way, because it's hysterical. It's one of my favorite things, but that they managed to do it within the whole point being like an appreciation for like, okay, you want to sit there and say, oh, it's quaint, it's out of tune, it's all this, like, you try, like see what a technological challenge this is, what a creative challenge it is to sort of figure out how to get what you want.
We wanted to do that for a game jam. We thought, well, we could do an Atari 2600 game. And so one of us who knows a bit more about programming looked at it and he said, well, guys, I don't know, like the processor cannot divide. So you can't like ask the math to like divide numbers. So
yeah, it really helps you appreciate what's there. And like anything, like just understanding that toolkit. This is why, like, if I took pretonal theory, and I'm learning modal harmony, versus somebody who has no exposure to that, just listening to music written with modes, like you have a different appreciation for like cadential approach and sort of the more horizontal way of thinking through polyphonic music instead of like our modern harmony imposing this vertical chord by chord sort of thinking. But it takes a little bit of exposure to like modal theory and what that means, and part writing and melodic construction. It really takes on a new dimension. Like even the medieval music seminars I took were looking at mostly monophonic Gregorian chant, but like really understanding the deep structure behind how these things are being constructed. Not to mention memorized by the monks. This huge body of work that they just committed to memory by doing it constantly and keeping the practice alive. But anyway, here we get into Dominic Guy's 3 forms of remixing, which is also super useful here. So purist remixing, this is sort of that the Atari 2600 Neil Lerner project, where in that case they were being given the original game and being told, okay, you have to compose something that will get onto the sound chip. A lot of them opted to just use the sort of synthy sound of that specific chip. So that there are folks that do that. Jake Kaufman, who's of course involved with DuckTales Remastered, for Shovel Knight, released the original Shovel Knight soundtrack as an NSF file, which those of us that do that stuff know is how we sort of, it's a fan created online way of understanding the original code. But like the idea was the entire soundtrack actually did fit on an NES cartridge if there was no game, like caveat, because there's a lot of music.
Yeah.
But he did make sure the entire soundtrack did fit on an NES cartridge.
Yeah, and there's a couple, like in the game itself, like the sound effects don't take the channels of the music, and there's a couple extra channels, I think, and things like that.
Yeah, he used like the Famicom disk system, like expansion chip.
The VRC6 Pro.
Yeah. So he has 6 channels.
Yeah. With more low registers as well in it, but brilliant use of it.
But still, it's like within at least a reasonable constraint. And then we also have renovative remixing. So this is the Final Fantasy VIII example. This is updating the graphics so that Squall, instead of having the black pools for his eyes, he has actually kind of disturbing to me, like, because I'm like, oh, I'm not used to seeing eyes. I'm used to just seeing the shadow, which felt right for his character because he's so broody. That actually bugged me when we played it. I was like, I can't handle like those piercing eyes. It's a little much. But this is an example of that renovative remix. We really didn't update that. We could tell the music was pretty much kept in its original form. There may have been some subtle changes, but it wasn't like the Pixel remasters where suddenly we have string quartet playing, versus the chiptune sound. And then derivative remixing. This is deriving inspiration from select retro elements while still having modern core elements. So a lot of these modern games, again, Stardew Valley is an example of that. It's a modern game, but it is kind of drawing on that style. So this is a really useful way of thinking of things. So for DuckTales Remastered, all of these are in play. So again, just like retrocursive and retrospective aren't mutually exclusive, we can get all 3 of these in the same game. So in DuckTales Remastered, it's purist in terms of the general game feel, the mechanics, the level design, room layouts, dimensions, physics of moving, jumping, enemy and treasure placement, all the just all of that stuff. It's renovative in terms of its audio-visual elements, in that the graphics are updated to modern 3D. The characters are done like cell animation. They look like modern cartoons. The soundtrack is remakes of the 8-bit songs for modern instruments, although we also have a way to access the originals in this game. And derivative, in that localized additions are made to modernize the game. So there's some new areas added in, new quests where players can find objects within the original levels, added cutscenes, added sections and songs. This is also something the Pixel remasters did a lot that we loved, where they extend the track by adding in a new solo, adding in a new break, adding in a new B section, whatever it is, to expand those tracks. And then dialogue is given in full voice acting instead of just text on screen. And we get this new intro and ending level. So all 3 of these things are happening. So this is a really useful way to think of these games. just how they're using retrocursive retrospective, but also the types of remixing that's happening within them. So thank you for that. I love it.
Hey, my pleasure.
Even the updates, though, in this game, that could very easily lead to sort of a disjointed experience where sort of you feel tugging at the seams of the retro and the modern. But here, a lot of those updates are done in service of the nostalgia, so it sort of keeps it consistent for the player. Holistically, it will feel a lot more seamless. It won't feel like, oh, that's the pure, you don't feel that breakdown until you're actually kind of analyzing it. The voice acting is performed by surviving cast members from the 1987 cartoon, which a lot of people loved. That got a lot of attention when the game came out. You can spend the in-game currency you collect to unlock things like concept art, sketches. There's a jukebox of the original music, and you can select it to play, right? Right. I remember when we did this, we're like, oh, let's hear the 8-bit. And even the sort of ultimate unlockable reward is digitized original animation cells from the original cartoon. So everything, lots of familiar scenarios from the show are being presented, which we had a little bit in the original game, the sort of that mention of, racing. But things like Scrooge swimming in his pool of gold, like iconic. We associate that with Scrooge.
There's such of a missed opportunity in that the pool should scale up and fill up with gold as you get more gold in the game, so you could like dive, but it doesn't. So I was sort of, oh, okay, what a bummer.
Yeah. There's a lot of these, again, it's palimpsest, so many more palimpsestic references to the original show appear throughout the game. So there's a couple examples given in the chapter, but this one, a puzzle has been added to the Amazon level for which the player needs to collect gold coins scattered around to open the way to an ancient temple. Apparently I have a weird thing that didn't display in the font. This echoes the 1987 episode 5, Too Much of a Gold Thing, good pun, where McDuck's gang finds giant golden discs placed across a valley that provide entrance to a lost temple in South America. So if you really know the show, you're going to appreciate some of these moments in the DuckTales Remastered.
Yeah, I was surprised because I told myself when I was writing the chapter and doing the research to write the chapter, I told myself, okay, I'm going to watch the old DuckTales show. So I looked it up. It was on Netflix. Or Disney Channel, rather. I started season 1, and I was like, okay, 1 episode, 2 episodes, 3 episodes, 4 episodes. And I was like, okay, And then I sort of looked, how many episodes are there? So I looked, and it's like 88 episodes.
So
because it was a daily.
So they didn't get quite I think it's 100 to be syndicated, where you really get to like.
I think it was like 88 in the first season, and then there was a second season.
There was 88 in the first season. Wow.
Yeah,
that's a lot.
So I looked at it and I was like, okay, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, we had Brent and TJ on last week, and there were only 4 seasons. I think it was like a 22 episode, like kind of standard TV. So they did watch all of Carmen Sandiego when they did theirs.
Wow.
Yeah, watch DuckTales. Excellent research. I'll tell you,
the things we do for science.
There was only 1 season of the Dragon's Lair cartoon, and
there was a cartoon.
Yeah, I mention it briefly in my chapter. It's
I haven't read it yet.
It's pretty it's interesting because Princess, not to devolve into my chapter, but Princess Daphne is so overly sexualized in the game as sort of a reward for the teen, hetero boy player, right? And they acknowledge that. They were like, we were trying to appeal to a 14-year-old arcade goer. So they have a very over the top. She's actually modeled on Playboy magazines. There's a lot of documentation about that. Everyone's saying, oh, it was really weird to walk past Don Bluth's office and he'd have these centerfolds out drawing Princess Daphne. And then they decided to make a Saturday morning cartoon out of it. So what do? You sanitize the princess. First of all, she gets to wear a dress that covers her up. So she has a long pink dress, and I don't know. It's just kind of poorly done. It's cheesy. It uses limited animation, which Bluth was famously against.
Right.
It's one of the reasons he
so I'm a little surprised to hear
founded
that.
his own. Yeah, he founded his own studio, but I guess they just got the rights to do the animation. So it wasn't, Bluth didn't produce it, but it was sort of made off of the popularity of the video game. It only lasted one season. It's a short season at that, and it's it's like hard to watch. But this was a show like that actually did pretty well. Yeah, there's a lot there in terms of TV adaptations of video games.
Actually, the best adaptation was The Legend of Zelda.
I sent Lisa, we were talking
series.
about this. I sent her a clip on YouTube of every time that Link goes, "Well, excuse me, princess."
Princess.
And it's long.
And but the music and the intro from that show is the Zelda theme. For me, it's that. This is Zelda. It's the animated show music.
Yeah. Yeah. We didn't get any chapters on that, but Lisa and I were talking about maybe writing about the cartoon together at some point. Because it wasn't in this volume, but it's kind of a great example of all these things. So all of this is to say, yes, okay, there's references and players will go, oh, cool, like that's from the cartoon. But it's not just about having this intertextual link between the hypertext and the hypotexts. It hints at a reading of DuckTales Remastered that will retroactively shed new light on the original game. So it changes how you read the original now. So then
I realized I was making big claims writing. And like I'm seeing this and I'm like, if I was reading this, I would be like, let's hear it.
Exactly. The following reading will transform our understanding of nostalgia and retro gaming from essentially aesthetic contemplative phenomena into tools for historiography. In other words, I had to put this quote in here because it's so good. In other words, we, to cite the classic DuckTales theme, might solve a mystery or rewrite history. I thought that was so elegantly deployed, and it's such an iconic moment in the DuckTales theme. Oh, I loved that.
And there's part of an estranging effect to writing this because I used to watch DuckTales, the show, when I was young in French.
Oh.
And so I researched the words for the English version of the show and the song.
Interesting.
And then I saw it and then I plugged it into because it's not at all what it says in French.
Oh, man. DuckTales. Woo.
You want to hear it in French?
Yeah, actually. I do.
I have to remember. It's like now I only have the English one in mind. So the basic structure is you will get into Scrooge McDuck's gang. So welcome to Scrooge McDuck's gang. And Scrooge McDuck is Picsou. And Picsou is like piqué, which is stealing, and sou, which is coins. So Picsou is like
coin stealer.
Money stealer, coin stealer. Yeah, exactly. So it's like c'est le plus grand. I need to see the lyrics because I'm mixing them. Parole. I want the lyrics. So I was remembering it right. Okay. C'est le plus grand boss de toute la ville, Picsou. Picsou. C'est le plus puissant de tout Canardville, Picsou. Picsou. Il vaut des milliards en or, en dollars, Picsou. Ouh. En suivant Fifi, Riri et Loulou, ouh. Nous entrerons dans la bande à Picsou. C'est le plus riche foie de canard, le plus chiche, le plus roublard. En suivant Fifi, Riri et Loulou, ouh. Nous entrerons dans la bande à Picsou. Ouh. On ne veut plus claquer du bec chez nous. Ouh. Nous voulons entrer dans la... That's that. Okay, that must be the French from France version. Different lyrics.
A little different. That's so cool. I love that.
So yeah, I mean, might solve a mystery or rewrite history. I was like reading this. I was like, no way. Okay. Wow.
Oh, I love that. That's so good. Oh, and as a sidebar, I should mention one of my proudest French puns ever is in Stardew Valley. I name all of my livestock puns. So I have a pig named Piggy Smalls, or like I have Piggy Pop, as the pigs. But you can get ducks in that game, and one of them is O Canada. So like Oh Canada, but it's Canard.
C'est bon,
C'est
c'est
bon.
bon.
It's one of my favorites in the mix. I think I have a ducktail duck in there too, because you have to.
Ducky McDuck.
Yep. Love that. So if we only look at DuckTales history, which we can, of course, go back to the comics and all of these earlier forms, but then it makes it easy to overlook another layer in the palimpsest, which is Capcom also made the Mega Man series, near and dear to my heart. When especially non-academics, non-musicians hear that I do video game music, they go, "Oh, what's the best video game soundtrack?" Of course, the last, "What's your favorite? What's the best?" I usually say the first 6 Mega Mans. I refuse to differentiate more than that, but I love them. I know those 6 really well.
You wouldn't go Mega Man 2 and 3 over the rest?
3 and 4.
Just a
3 and
question.
4 are
3 and 4.
my real jams. Partially because I played 3 and 4 before I played 2 and 1. So after you have the slide and the Mega Buster charge, it's sort of harder to go back. So I struggle, especially with 2. 1 is removed enough that it's kind of its own thing, but 2 is sort of difficult for me as a player. But I obviously love it musically. But yeah, 3 and 4 are probably my top.
It is harder, and I'm noticing a real difference in between the soundtracks to 1 and 2 and the rest of the series. There's an added mastery of the vibrato and the interplays, and I'm not sure exactly what, but like there's a notable difference in the quality and the care and sound design that's going on from 3 on.
Yes. It's like they were sort of finding their voice, and then they figured out, it was always, it was Rockman in Japan. It was always based on that idea. And certainly in 3, we have the blues whistle for Proto Man. And, but they really sort of figure out the signature, the audio signature, the gameplay signature, the graphics, everything, that really make it feel coherent. The first 6 really go together really nicely, and of course then X is its own thing. So what's useful here, these games were being developed, at least the first 2 Mega Mans, about the same time, and so there are a lot of apparent similarities in the game engine, the graphics, and music. A lot of folks online will insist that it's using the exact same engine from Mega Man to make DuckTales. I'm sure folks working on it was easy to use some of the same stuff. Like, absolutely, that's possible. I don't know that it's a direct rip or anything, but not in the way that like Doki Doki Panic and Mario 2, it's basically just a reskin of Doki Doki Panic, which is why it feels so out of place in Mario history. Also one of my, something about the NES sequels, they were not afraid to be very different. Zelda 2, Mario 2, they were so different from the originals, and yet it wasn't inconsistent for me.
Right. It's also a really interesting example because you just named Mario 2 and said, it's so out of place with the other Mario games. But like if we go retrocursive and go back at that time, then Mario 2 comes out, and I mean it's not really weirder than Mario 1 was, with its giant turtle and shrooms and fire flowers and pipes and things like that, and flying turtles.
And for me, the
so Mario
first
2
3
is like,
were
okay,
all
this
very
is what
different
it is
from each other. Because in 3 you had the Tanuki suit and the raccoon suit, and so
and the world maps,
and I loved
going the water world and the ice world.
I love to. So I've always kind of held up the second in the sequels, in the trilogies here, as being really, really interesting. And then in modern day you're like, oh, they didn't really stick with that in some ways. They don't come back to it the way they come back to some of these other ones, but they were willing to go in a very different direction for some of these sequel games. Mega Man, I think, is a little more consistent. They mostly just keep like refining, adding. It always sort of had a really strong identity for the company.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of the odd man out, so to speak, because the prior way to think about games was to think about the character, and then you have your character, and then he appears in this game, and this game, and this game, but they are all different games. That was sort of the model from the arcade era transitioning into the early home consoles. So you had Mario or Jumpman. He was in Donkey Kong. He was in Wrecking Crew, and then he was in whatever, and then he ended up in Mario Brothers, and then you would go into Mario Brothers 2, which is another type of game, but with the same character. But the character is the key here. And then at one point it became, okay, the game is this sort of formula, and it has to be this sort of gameplay, and then that becomes the basis for making sequels.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of similarities here. Capcom did produce both, and many of the same staff worked on both. So there's an instant connection to be made here. So some of the comparisons to Mega Man also sort of suggest that DuckTales was possibly rushed, as a lot of adaptations tend to be, where Mega Man has a fully developed endgame section where you're moving through Dr. Wily's fortress, so we get all these new levels at the end. DuckTales just repeats the Transylvania level. It's also a relatively sparse soundtrack in DuckTales, seems to kind of cut abruptly short at the end. And the tracks themselves are a lot shorter than the Mega Man tracks. So DuckTales offers no new music after the 5 core levels. So it was sort of like, okay, those are done. And then the opening theme bookends the game. And then there's a nice chart looking at even just the length of the loops is a lot shorter. So like just the overall amount of music in the game is a lot less for DuckTales. But then you have a very useful comparison of the stage select themes from Mega Man 2 versus DuckTales. And a stage select theme, you're not meant to be on there for long. So they by nature are going to be short loops. And yet this is a perfect demonstration of the difference in complexity, even in 2 very short loops. So we'll see the figure and listen to them on the next page. Mega Man 2 has an intro and then a 4-bar repeating phrase, and it uses 4 of the sound channels on the NES. DuckTales uses only 2 of the sound channels and just a 2-bar phrase. And even just, we'll see the 2. Let's listen to Mega Man 2 here for a minute. I love this one. And like, I don't feel a need to stop that one after a couple loops. Really, you're just like, yeah, like I'm doing my thing. It fits well, and notably for those that pay attention to chip notation and stuff, squares are condensed, hence chords. These are of course monophonic channels, but for the sake of looking pretty on the page and space, we have squares. So, and then so it is 4 channels. Then figure 10.2, we get the stage select theme from DuckTales, and we can both see the differences. I also love that you put ostinato ad nauseum. that was a nice touch. So here's how the DuckTales one sounds by contrast. There's also something about the piercing quality of the register of the square, where you're just like, I'm not gonna stay on this screen for a while.
Yeah, this square becomes a triangle piercing right through your ear.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's pretty high pitched. It just has a bit of like a stringent quality to it.
By the way, I just want to say thank you so much for putting out the call for this anthology and for accepting my paper. This is the very first music staff that I write. So
amazing.
Yeah, I don't know music, so so you suggested to use a MuseScore, so I went to MuseScore and I sort of fiddled around with it to get it.
Yeah.
So it's special to me.
It turned out great. I think yours I didn't really have to mess with, because what I had explained on a previous stream, I actually took because people did stuff in Finale, they did it in Sibelius, and I was really picky. I wanted like both the music typesetting to look uniform across the book, but also just like the fonts used within the music notation software. I wanted it to be consistent for everything in the book. So I actually retypeset every single person's examples. I don't think I had to mess with yours much though, other than I may have adjusted like spacing on the measures a little bit just to like, but yours was already in MuseScore, so yeah, I was able to do that. But that was like a silly thing that like most people would not care as long as the example is clear and looks nice. But it was important to me that everything matched. So. So yeah, I did take those. Yeah, wow, I didn't realize that. That's amazing. These are great.
I was very nervous.
Yeah, they turned out good. So the retro as historiography, which was alluded to earlier, that it gives us a way to think about historiography. Um, DuckTales Remastered seems to sort of finish the elements that felt unfinished in the original, which is really satisfying for a player that knows both. Obviously, somebody new to the whole thing is going to get just like a nice game, a nice complete feeling game. But it takes this extra weight for the folks that have that sort of retro stance toward it. We get a new final stage in Mount Vesuvius instead of just looping back and repeating the Transylvania stage. We get dialogue that's giving us more narrative now with motivations for, Glomgold and Majika Dispel's plan. We get added narrative. We get addition of the money bin tutorial level. And we also get both of these retrospective and retrocursive stances evident in the soundtrack by Jake Kaufman, who I love. That Shovel Knight score I listen to all the time. This one too is great. Jake Kaufman is an expert in chiptune. Again, released the Shovel Knight first game score in like an original sound format for the NES. Really knows the tech, knows exactly how those channels worked, exactly how to program for them. And so Kaufman did reorchestrate and create these new arrangements of the original. But even in these newly orchestrated tracks, there's little palimpsests here. He uses chiptunes to add to the aesthetic. And then, of course, there's the ability for the players to choose between the original and new versions in play. But if you think for a second and go, but we added new levels. So if we can switch to the original version, what do we do when we switch to the 8-bit and there wasn't that level in the original game? Kaufman actually wrote 8-bit versions as well that didn't exist in the original for the new levels that were added, and he created them within the NES hardware specifications because that's what he does. He's amazing. And this is my favorite moment here, where the music for the fight against Dracula Duck is particularly notable in that Kaufman's piece features a long buildup of rising tension spread across two movements totaling 32 seconds that can be likened to a verse and pre-chorus structure, leading into a release of tension with the chorus, which spotlights the central motif of the original Transylvania theme, which we'll see on the next page. As players encountered it earlier, this reoccurrence subtly highlights Dracula Duck's ties to this place and, more importantly, recalls the original game's ending, further establishing how much the remaster improves upon the original. So here we get this like beautiful bow around the idea. So here's the motif of the Transylvania theme. Let's hear it. It's a bop. All right, and it goes into B section. It's real good. Take a listen. Now hear how this Transylvania theme occurs in Kaufman's final boss. So good.
You can sort of see the vampire duck vampire on his organ going, ha ha.
Oh, Jake Kaufman is so good. I just love every project that I have seen from him. And I really
me too.
wish Ryan had like a deeper I think he kind of knows him like a little bit. I'm like, oh, if you could have invited him when we streamed Shovel Knight, I that would have
Oh
been amazing.
wow.
Or we streamed the remaster actually, and we compared it with the original and stuff. So we talked a lot about his music in those two places. I'm like, we gotta like find a way to get to know him and we have him on the stream with us, because I love when when we've had like John Robert Matz came and did Chia with us, and it's cool when the composer's there
Yeah,
with us.
you could try. Yeah, pretty much. You could try playing Retro City
That's a good
Rampage,
one.
because he was one of the three musicians doing the soundtrack. There's three of them. It's I actually don't remember who the two others are, but they are pretty famous too. That's too bad. I've listened to it, but I guess it's interesting because Retro City Rampage has these themes that are pastiches of. So there's like the track that's called Not Mega, which is Mega Man 2 intro, but it's not. So, but it really, really, really mimics the structure of the Mega Man 2 intro,
I
and
love
it's really
that.
well done.
That's very, very up my alley. So, by way of conclusion, then we do have a really good question in the chat we can get to here. DuckTales Remastered manifests a complex mixture of both retro stances. Its diagnostic of the original's problems and missed opportunities is rooted in a retrocursive displacement back to its position in 1989 gaming, with an outreach to include some future developments in the genre. Its renovative treatment is practiced through a nostalgic retrospective stance on the 1989 game and its 1987 Source television series. Through its music, graphics, level and game design, bonus content, and narrative, it provides a synthesis of the timeless appeal of its classic design and timely modernization, achieving a retro-modern design that stimulates interest in the source material and provides an occasion to reflect on video game history. So, coming back to the opening, this whole thing with Della Duck and the lullaby and the 2017 animated show and the power of that moment. The moon theme from the 1989 video game appearing in the 2017 animated reboot ties in the loose, disconnected ends together, just as the 2013 video game provides the last quack that completes the long, unfinished business its 1989 predecessor had left in suspension. Maybe the power of retro lies in harmonizing history with our life, strange and vast, connecting things and having them conform to some higher purpose. In short, making the world feel right. So good. So that's the chapter, but we do have a wonderful question here in the chat, which I will read aloud for the sake of the VOD as I get back to the intro. Yeah, there we go. That's a nice screen to leave it on. First time chat here from Dermathius says, hi y'all, I don't mean to interrupt the presentation, you can answer this later. Writing my bachelor thesis on storytelling through music and gameplay, and recommending works that we think need to be in a work that aim to analyze the narrative aspect of music in video games. And you are the perfect person to ask this to because of your work on narrative. So what sort of recommendations do you have?
Well, the question is what's on storytelling through music.
That's true.
So I'm not sure how much, because there's this. I'm teaching a graduate seminar on narration, and sometimes I get music students, but often it's just film and literature students. And when I get some music students, then we sort of have to ask, what is narrative music, and how is music narrative, and is it? And is it intrinsically narrative, or can it be used to convey some external pre-existing narratives? And, the answer to the latter is, of course, yes. And then the meaning of is music inherently narrative gets a whole lot different depending on who answers, because some people feel that, if you have something like bum, 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 then, it's narrative because, there's a story there. So to narratologists, it's not, because there's nothing specific. You can't relate. You can tie it to characters. You can describe it to a situation and things like that. So, there's a sort of proto-narrative content in there, in that there's tension and then there's release. And that happens in a lot of action scenes, or a lot of scenes in general. But without the specificity of the situation, then you don't get into a narrative. You get into some form of discourse or observation on the state of being, or how emotions work, or how, things like that. So I'm not sure about the music part of it. If you want to read about narration and storytelling in games, there's a huge ton of resources. You have some of them that are from professionals in the industry, in the games industry, and they think a lot about how to make and articulate stories. The thinking on that goes through structures. So, what are the storytelling structures, the branching narratives, and the loops, and things like that? What are open world principles for injecting story in games? And then some of the thinking also goes into what is the narrative way of playing, in that it's players that have to tie up what happens into a narrative. And basically, if you play a game that's full of rules interacting without a pre-scripted narrative, then you can still have your own story coming out of it. It emerges out of it. So one of the first texts maybe is Henry Jenkins on game design as narrative architecture. This is from 2005.
Snaps of
So
agreement. Yes. Jenkins' work in
thank you,
general
Dominic.
is really illuminating.
So that's a good starting point. I have like my own master's thesis that was on narration in games, but there's a lot of people who have written on narrative in games, especially. There's Marie-Laure Ryan. She has written lots of books and edited books on narrative in games. But then, so it's sort of this weird multi-angled question.
Yeah, and I would say to follow up, if you could give us any examples of types of games you're working on. One thing that like instantly came to mind that I'm hoping to feature on the channel soon is Wesley Bradford's exploring the narrative implications of emerging topics in Breath of the Wild, which was a Journal of Sound and Music and Games article. And of course, that Legend of Zelda has like this huge franchise history. It's actually a pretty complicated narrative. We have entire books about the timeline of Zelda, right? Like kind of teasing out all of these threads that have emerged because we ended up creating so many games across history. But then, tracing that thread in a specific game. Kieran Collins has stuff on narrative in racing games. I can't remember what that's in offhand.
It's
like
hard to
talking
really
about
give
Forza,
pointers.
Gran Turismo, like Need for Speed, like that type of stuff. But it's been a minute. Lombardi's World and Sayonara Wild Hearts. I'm not familiar with either of those. That's neat. Certainly, Julian Grasso's dissertation has some really beautiful moments on musical narrative in gaming, and sort of aesthetic and affect theory and stuff like that. I'm trying to think what else. It's something that comes up as a keyword like all the time, but in terms of stuff being like about narrative in the same way. I mean, really, there's, as I'm sure you've encountered in your research here, Dermithius, there's a long history of grappling with the question of non-texted, non-vocal music, instrumental music, and how does it signify? So like musical semiotics. A lot of that stuff is going to be as good a background as sort of any game-specific work. I'm thinking back to questions of music meaning, of Stravinsky, basically saying music can't narrate. There's so much that you could be drawing on. It's sort of it's a big topic, and so it is hard to narrate in terms of anything that like I'm like, oh, this absolutely has to be in there. I think of research as almost like foraging, which I'm doing a lot of in the new Zelda game. I keep just like not doing the plot because I'm going to grab mushrooms from places.
Right. Hey, have you played the game Forager?
No, but it sounds very, very up my alley.
It could become an obsession, but it's really good.
Oh, what's it for? Is it like a Steam game? Or?
It's I think it's on every platform. It was on Switch and PS4 back in the days, so I'm guessing it's on pretty much everything. But it's basically graphic style, kind of like Fez, I guess.
Okay.
Pixel art, cute, cuddly, and how can I describe it? You sort of wander around the top view map and you grab things and then you use those things to collect them and then to feed other things and build structures, and then you buy plots of land and find other things, and things grow, and basically you put down fish traps and catch fish and then you eat and then you use that energy to do other things, and but it really builds and emerges into something much
Oh,
bigger, so it's really fun.
that's fun. Some other things, like as I'm thinking, as I'm perusing the classic SSSMG bibliography, which I'll link to here. It's a great resource. Um, William Gibbons has some great work on popular music narrative and dystopia and Bioshock in game studies, and then he kind of continues on that in his Bioshock chapter in Unlimited Replays, where he talks about these really interesting narrative uses of music. So that's a possibility for you. That's going to be like very nicely put. There's also there's a doctoral thesis that I'm seeing that just came out that I will link here on storytelling in the music of art games, focusing on things like Journey, Shadow of the Colossus, and Undertale, which I've not read yet. But again, this is the beauty of this thing being updated. So that's a possibility. That looks like 2021, so fairly recent. I haven't really been working on like narrative specifically, which is why I don't have a ton of that. But yeah, there's some stuff from like composition standpoints in here where you'll see like strategies for narrative and adaptive game scoring, that type of stuff. But I'd say it comes up incidentally in a lot of our work, which is why it's a little hard to sort of pinpoint like what needs to be there, which is why my recommendation is generally to go to sort of the field as a whole instead of looking to musicology specifically. Like there's going to be things in terms of just like methodological approaches to game sound that you can glean even if it has nothing to do with what you're working. Like I'm always just referencing whatever I'm reading lately that's interesting to me. It finds a way into the work that I'm doing. But I do just it is very much foraging. I just gather as much as I can, and then I start sort of sorting through it and really like looking for, okay, what exactly. I always do too much research, and then navigating that literature review is a lot of work, especially if I'm doing a short chapter and space is at a premium. I'm usually trying to find out, okay, I have my own things to say too, so like how do I set this up and point people to these things without getting into it myself. So I know this problem well, but I think being widely read is going to be a boon, because triangulating from all of these disparate discourses can actually be a really useful way of structuring your work and kind of giving it a unique feel in a field. So that's my recommendation. But yeah, the SSSMG bibliography is pretty well updated. There's new stuff on there all the time that I come across that I haven't seen yet, and so that's a nice thing. And then my literature review here is an attempt for at least me to stay current with what's happening in the field. And hopefully other people get something out of it too. But it is very selfish in the end. It helps me to stay well read. Because, when you have to go to teach something, you end up knowing it better than if you're just coming across it in sort of a superficial way. Because then I'm having to take notes. I'm having to summarize, turn it into these PowerPoints, pull what's interesting, listen to the examples. And it ends up being a nice space for us. So yeah, I really love this chapter, because, again, there's always that, like, I'm going to give you this new toolkit. Like, I think maybe theorists do this a lot more, but like in musicology, I think a lot of us are afraid of overpromising and like having things not be very applicable, outside of their context. So there is that sense of like, oh, really? You're going to give me a new toolkit? But then, obviously, if I thought that this didn't deliver, I would have said something as your editor on this. I just thought it was really thoughtfully constructed. You deploy the literature really well and create your framework, but also show, the limits of some of those sources not being rooted in games, that game studies sort of and popular discourse around gaming has its own idiosyncratic uses of some of these terms, which add a layer of difficulty here, and ends up
Right.
being, I think, very, very easy to understand with like the way that you have shown. There's a lot of terminology and a lot of big words in here with like the intertextuality and everything, but the way that you have shown the examples, I find this very good as a teaching text. I find the framework in it useful for looking at a wide array of games, especially in the modern landscape where we're seeing a lot of reuse, a lot of remasters, a lot of remakes. And it was just really fun to get something on DuckTales too, because like that's a necessary component of a volume on intersections of animation, video games, and music. My goodness, gotta have DuckTales in there. So we were excited to see this one come in. I'm pretty sure when Lisa and I met to go over the proposals, we were like instant yes. Like, yep, this awesome. Looks great. And there were definitely a few like that where we were like, oh, absolutely, And then a few where we're like, oh, I want to see what they do, where we were like waiting to see what's the connection going to be between the sort of three areas. This one just had it at the outset, which is nice because some of us, me included, had to sort of like, initially I was thinking, oh, Dragon's Lair is animated, right? It was full cell animation in the early 80s. So I was like, well, there's my animation piece. And then I found out that there was a 1-season TV show by Ruby Spears. And I was like, oh, okay. Now I can kind of bring that into the chapter. But I found that like after I'd started the research, I was like, oh, there was actually a cartoon that apparently, I haven't met anyone that's like, oh, I remember watching that because wasn't on long enough to be syndicated, didn't make enough episodes. It was only one season and then it got canceled. So it's a little bit of a deep dive. I found I was able to purchase the season on Amazon. So that's how I watched it.
That is cool.
And then I did the transcription of the title theme just to have it in there because I love a good transcription. I'm very biased toward them. So certainly some of the best people to ask are Matthias, I don't know what time zone you're in or anything, but if you watch the Thursday night stream at Bardic Knowledge, I'll put the thing in the chat. Did I spell that right? Yes. Ryan's channel, Julianne Grasso, that streams with us, is a really good source. Somebody who's been very interested in narrative and game sound for a while. And so I did point you to her dissertation, but a lot of her thinking has been around how does game music tell? How does it tell the story?
Notably, there's an important concept she contributed that's called the oh shit moment.
Oh, yes, importantly. A lot of us have actually cited it. Yeah, she gave a great paper. She was talking about, in Mario 1 when you get down to 100 seconds on the timer and there's a little da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and then the music doubles in tempo. She, in an academic setting, referred to that as the oh shit moment, and everyone just loved it. So they're like, well, that is what it is. Yeah.
I actually read that somewhere.
It's so popular. I actually, at one point, she made a pun. I think it was on stream where we were talking about translations of pre-existing music into chiptune, and this ended up in my Bach chapter, my Bach article, where I looked at the uses of the Bach D minor, toccata, and fugue in 8-bit gaming because it's public domain. It was easy to encode, right? Like you just like translate into your little arrangement in the chip, and she referred to it as a transbitteration instead of a transliteration, and I loved that, and I actually like worked it into my article, and I cited her and everything. So I have the more highbrow Julian Grasso citation, but that's awesome that you read that. But yeah, our Thursday night stream, we game like Twitch streamers generally do. We play games and we talk about academia. We talk about, in my case, being a working musician. I have a lot of weddings this summer. I have one tomorrow. And we talk about the music of the games that we're playing. And it's a pretty robust space. The chat is as valuable to the process as any of us, because we have weeks where we're just tired. We're not as like as tapped into what's happening. And then somebody in the chat will say something really smart. We're like, yep, that's it. That's what's happening. So, because it's mostly music academic types. So it's a good space to kind of encounter us.
You saw it here, folks.
Certainly keep an eye out for the North American Conference on Video Game Music. The call for papers will probably go out in the fall, and
Where is it
it's going to
located?
be at Michigan State this year. Ryan's hosting, so
And what is the time?
I don't remember.
Okay,
It's
okay.
all
But
he's
didn't
scheduling it
mean
with
to
the
put you.
university, booking the spaces. So I don't
All right.
remember what they landed on. If it was like March, April, somewhere in
Okay.
there. I don't
That's
remember. He's so we're working on that. So that's a great space to encounter all of us as well. So Dominic, what's next for you? For you, what do you have? What do you have in progress?
So right now, music-wise, also, I'm waiting for a response from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, to which you apply for funding for research projects. I applied for a what's it called? Insight Development Grant, which is so they have the Insight grants, which are like 5 years research projects with like good bit of money to get your thing going, and keep doing what you're already doing. But they also have another program that's a development program for researchers to engage in new directions and try something new. And I applied for one of those to get a research project to study the links between heavy metal and video games. It's kind of an interesting thing. I've been like giving conferences, and I've written 2 papers on that since 2013. So I've written a bit about it, but I haven't really actually done the big research around it. So I was looking at the links, historical links and cultural links and aesthetic links. But I and my colleagues who are co-applicants want to really explore this in more detail and look at a couple hypotheses. To explain or at least understand and map out those links, because it's easy to say that video games share a lot with metal in terms of fantasy and medievalism and things like that. But then it's also about, different trajectories. And so we want to do things like distribute questionnaires to people working in the games industry to poke and see their attitudes toward metal music
Yeah.
and verify that against the whole
Mm-hmm.
population. And then we also want to identify a cohort effect that I suspect might be happening around the people that played NES games when back then in the 80s and 90s. I think that may have predisposed them to an openness to heavy metal
Mm.
because of the construction and the constraints of
I'm one of
composing
them. I
music.
listened to a lot of metal in high school. I leaned a little more like prog metal, black metal, gothic metal, that kind of vein. This more symphonic-y, you know. It was
Right.
yeah. Um, so I'm definitely one of those people, and I think that it had to do a little bit for me. And this is not something I could have articulated back then, but now I can because I do this stuff. There was something to me about having, in the NES you have the limited number of channels, but like it means that there's nobody just like generally just sustaining whole notes, right? There's usually very active, all the harmonies, all of the counter melodies, all of the ostinatos, the bass lines, everything is moving, and everybody gets a very intricate line. And there's something that happens similarly in like progressive metal where like we are layering up
Yep.
things that on their own are really cool even in isolation. Nobody gets a boring part.
Right.
And so I really was drawn to that idea. Not that I don't love a good simple harmony, pop tune. And I do plenty of that. I do plenty of pop hits off the radio for my string quartets and stuff. But I really enjoy when like everybody's getting a really intricate part like that. And so I think that's a piece of it for me. That was my predisposition to liking that in music. And then of course I was studying classical music, where we also do get a good amount of counterpoint and things moving in that way. In spaces we're used to having like this really intricate construction there too. So I appreciate that. I bet, have you interfaced much with like Rich Anatone and like Greg Rossetti, who are also obsessed right now with like rock music and gaming and like all? I imagine the three of you are just going to be thick as thieves with your work.
We have talked a little, but I noted them as potential collaborators if I do get the grant. So
Awesome.
that might be something that's used to set up something with them, and then maybe afterwards apply for an Insight
Oh,
grant.
I love it.
But I'm also interfacing with the ISMMS, which is the International Society for Metal Music Studies.
Cool.
I've been there once, and I'm going to be there next week because they're in Montreal for the biannual conference. So I'll be giving a talk there next week about video games and music, presenting my research project and seeing what kind of echo it has on their end.
And thanks for the recommendation. I will check out Sayonara Wild Hearts. I don't do a lot of runners, but I love a game with a strong aesthetic that commits to it. So I'm a big fan.
Sayonara Wild Hearts.
Sayonara Wild Hearts. It's good recommendation. I love getting recommendations.
It's a dreamy arcade game about riding motorcycles, skateboarding, dance battling, shooting lasers, wielding swords, and then I didn't I didn't
That's
see the
a
rest
lot of
it.
things.
It's promising.
That's promising a lot of things. So that's great.
Okay, music-based action game.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
I love that. Love that kind of thing.
Looks great. Great aesthetics.
I always love. I'm teaching a video game class right now, and I love seeing what folks do their final projects on. If it's a game that I don't know, because I get some really interesting recommendations that way as well. Because man, no matter how much of a gamer you are, there just aren't enough hours to have played it. And for some of us, there's even some surprising gaps in our gaming histories. Like the one I like to shock people with is Pokemon. I've never played a Pokemon game.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah, I'm really not
like
the only
when
one. Will Gibbons also hasn't played, but like there's a surprising number of us that just kind of missed Pokemon as a phenomenon.
I mean, when Pokemon came out, it was like in 1998 or
Late
something
90s, yeah.
in North America. And like I was like 15 or 16 years old because there was no way I was going to look at that.
Yeah.
It was for kids.
Right.
It was for kiddies.
Absolutely.
So
So it's like interesting like where everybody has the lacuna in their gaming history. And I mentioned my brother and I jumped over to PC gaming because we couldn't keep up with consoles, so we missed N64.
Right.
And like for a lot of people my age, that's a touchstone. So last summer we were having me suffer through Ocarina of Time, which I was struggling with because I had missed that entire system. So like nothing about the gaming felt normal to me. Even some of the visual clues, like I wasn't reading things as being background versus like interactable in the right ways,
Right.
because I'm just like not into the norms of that system. So like along the way they're having to tell me, oh, you can climb that wall. I'm like, really? So that was a really interesting experience for me. Yeah. And with Tim Summers' book, that was sort of the thought, was like I was reading his book to work on a review of it and playing the game for the first time. And like I obviously know the music because it's been in so many other Zeldas. Like I'm pretty familiar with the soundtrack, but I wasn't familiar with the gameplay. So really interesting stuff. Yeah, I don't know if definitely in my case it wasn't like a too cool for Pokemon. It was partially that we just weren't. I only had like 2 games for the Game Boy, and one of them was Tetris and one of them was the Harvest Moon when it got ported. Or I guess the version that they put out for the Game Boy. So I didn't like stick with the mobile gaming, and in my case I knew Pokemon as a phenomenon. I knew the cartoon pretty well.
I'd just like to take a moment to say that if you're interested in Tetris, and especially Tetris for the Game Boy, there's this book called 50 Key Video Games, in which there's a chapter written by Dana Plank on Tetris.
It's fun. Yeah. It was kind of a neat moment because I was your editor on this book and then you were my editor on that book. Reached out and said, my first publication is on the music of Tetris. Came out of a Cold War music seminar that I took where I was like, I don't know what I'm going to write on. So I ended up writing about Tetris. And Dominic was like, we're doing this 50 key games and like this is an important game. Can you write? It was like 2,500 word, like nice little short bites of chapters. And me sitting there going, I don't know if I have anything else to say about Tetris. I kind of already wrote that, and then thinking, okay, well, this is about like defining what makes something important. And so here I am saying like, yeah, I mean, the game code, like a lot of people have said like that game design is essentially perfect. I mean, you will hear people talk about it in those terms. But I was interested in the idea that in terms of there's a difference between like a game being perfect and it becoming a cultural icon. And I think that the music and the design that they chose to put in the US versions to give it that very like specific Russian origin using the Korobeiniki folk tune. I was like, that was where I hit the, oh, okay, I can fit this into the volume, because that's going to be my argument, is that like there's a difference between the game being perfect and it becoming an icon, and part of that difference is the music. So that's that chapter.
And it's also that there's a zillion versions of Tetris, but what is the one iconic version of Tetris? It's the Game Boy one, because of its music.
Yeah.
And I think that is true, because like I I hear the Game Boy music of Tetris when I think about Tetris music.
Yeah, even more so than the NES one. Yeah. Which...
And the NES one, it tries to mimic, I think, almost perfectly, I guess, the Game Boy one. I'm not...
The NES predated the Game Boy slightly, yeah.
Right, but it's the same kind of instruments,
yeah.
and...
It uses more like other Russian track. Like it's in line with what they were planning, because it uses like Tchaikovsky
right
stuff.
Right.
So yeah, it's good stuff. It's a fun volume. Julian Grasso's in it. I'm trying to think, like there's a few of us like Ludo folks that Dominic was able to recruit into the fold.
Exactly.
Even though like it's got a nice basis in people from all across like different avenues of studying video games, so it's not just like a Ludomusicology volume, but there were some spots where Dominic was able to hook some of us in where the game itself has a strong musical imprint and get us to write on those.
Yeah, there's a lot of people from music that I was trying to get on board, and that all got on board, so that was cool. I'm looking at the list of contributors. There's Julian Grasso. There's who has written on Zelda for the book. There's there's Andrei Vaniscu, which I didn't recruit. It's Kelly Boudreau, because they were colleagues at the same university in the UK.
Andre does Andrei Vaniscu work. Yeah,
has written on Guitar Hero. No, that's Kelly. Kelly Boudreau has written on Guitar Hero, and Andra has written on Dance Revolution for this book. There's Jessica Kizir, or Kizire, I'm not sure how to pronounce, who is in interpretation. She has her PhD in musicology, and she studies music and popular media. There's
she's done some like nostalgia and Final Fantasy.
Right. There's and she writes on Final Fantasy VII for this book, and there's Neil Lerner who has written on Donkey Kong.
Love Neil Lerner. Neil Lerner was my external reader on my dissertation, and he's a huge mentor in my life. I just adore Neil. He's going to be on this channel eventually. We have been trying to schedule it for over a year now.
And there's Dana Blank, as we said. And that's our people from Ludomusicology.
That's a fun volume. It's really nice. Actually, the Dragon Slayer chapter in that led me to the book on it. I'm trying to remember the name of the contributor now, and I feel bad that I'm forgetting. Mark.
It's Mark. Hold on. I had it like right over here. But I think that's a weakness in our volume, is that you have to turn over to the chapter to see who has written the chapter, because the table of content does not list the contributors next to the chapter that they have written. So it's Michael Clark.
Oh, Michael Clark.
Michael Clark.
Yes, MJ Clark. Right. So I read this chapter right as I was and then had found out the book had literally just come out. Like 2 weeks before I was supposed to have my chapter done. I was like... So I got an ebook. I read the entire book in 2 days, because I'm like, I can't neglect that. It's the source. If I'm writing a chapter on the game, and actually he didn't speak to the music at all, so it worked out. But it ended up being really important. I ended up reframing a lot of my chapter around it, but it was because of this book. I thought of it. I was like, oh, there's a Dragon's Lair, and then I saw like in the bio, I think it said was working on a volume, and so I looked it up and it had come out. So. Really useful stuff. It's good volume, but I'm excited. And of course the link tree from above has the links to some of these creative projects combining chiptune and metal, which is so good. So I definitely recommend that. But thank you so much for the generosity of your time and for contributing what I think is a really strong chapter to this volume.
Well, thank you so much just for hosting the stream, but also for like editing the book and being such a, because some editors will receive the text and then point out one or two places, and then that's it. And it's okay, but I mean, it's so nice when your editor really, really asks questions and thinks about things. And we had some really great back and forth
I
exchanges.
thought so too. It was a goal to not be, again, very top down, very authoritative, where it was just about tearing apart what anybody had. We wanted it to feel collaborative, and Lisa and I. It helped that we just agreed on everything. It was very strange that there was almost no place where I had a different take than or it was mostly like, here's different options of how you might do this, but we didn't really have disagreements in terms of where we thought the text should go. And that also was nice, that it wasn't like you were having two editors with very different views on what needed to happen, and then you're trying to reconcile that as the author. It was nice that we were able to like just put things on the same Word document and send it back, and have a lot of these conversations with our authors. So it's a model I'd like to carry forward. I'd like to create. I like the editing. I think I'm decently good, especially at the nitpicky stuff that a lot of people don't care about or don't want to do. So I kind of enjoy that. So I'm like, I can bring that little side interest, but also really think about like creating opportunities for colleagues to get their good work out there, and like just thinking about facilitating that. It's like, that's whatever power I wield as a precarious adjunct. Like, I don't have a lot of institutional power within a particular school, but I do have some, like, in the field at large, in my involvement with some of the conferences, and certainly this new publishing stuff that I'm doing, being able to create these opportunities for people. So I'm glad it went well, and thank you so much for being here. And everyone, enjoy your Friday. Next week, I may reschedule, or I may be off because I have a wedding gig. I have like a Friday afternoon. I think my call time is 3. So
To be fair, it's a good time to be wed, I guess, Friday afternoon.
We're seeing a wedding boom from COVID. A lot of people didn't get, maybe they
Right.
had a wedding planned, and or they were getting engaged, and so we have just this almost like backup in the pipeline of weddings that mean that last year in particular, and this year, we're seeing just so many requests come in. The existing musicians in the gig scene are constantly like, can you take this one? I can't. We're trying to just like slot everybody in to get these things covered. We're telling people, like, you're having to book a little more than you normally would in advance. But we are seeing a lot more Sunday and Friday weddings because of that. That's traditionally been a good way to save money too, because like Saturday is kind of the prime time. But we are seeing a lot more people have these. They're not really off season anymore. Like, I don't know how much of I think some of the venues have wisened up that those dates are it may not be much of a saving for those people, but I think Fridays in particular, because not everyone is going to take the whole day off to come to the wedding. They could have one at like 4 or 5, and local folks could just come after work or whatever. So we're seeing a lot more of these, but I don't have a ton of Fridays because I haven't taken a bunch of them, but I do have one next Friday. So if I do a stream, I will of course announce it on Twitter. I will try to get it in my Discord. I've been bad about updating my Discord, but thank you for stopping by, everyone. Have a nice weekend. Enjoy whatever weather you all are having. It's on the warm side here. It's getting very summery, so have a great weekend.